He inherited a church, then found a sealed room behind the altar no one knew existed. You don't expect to inherit silence. You expect old hymnals, pews that creak, maybe a brass cross with fingerprints from 1,000 prayers. But what I inherited was heavier than all of that. Not in weight, in presence, in the way the shadows refused to leave certain corners of the church at night. My father used to say, St. Bellamy Church wasn't just a building, it was a secret no one dared say aloud. And maybe I should have believed him sooner, because the truth was never buried underground. It was sealed behind a wall, watching, waiting. I never wanted to return to the church. That's the honest part. After my father passed, I had every reason to sell it, hand the keys to someone else, and move on. But something in me, perhaps guilt, perhaps unfinished business, wouldn't let go. So I came back. I drove the winding road through ash-colored trees and cracked pavement, all the way to the edge of Briar Falls, where the church stood like an old memory someone forgot to bury. It was early spring, and the vines hadn't grown in yet, so the building looked barer than I remembered, like someone had undressed it in its sleep. Cold stone walls, a rusting gate, and stained glass windows that had stopped telling stories a long time ago. The inside smelled of cedar and age. Dust rose in the light like spirits suspended mid-prayer. I took my time walking through the aisles, letting my fingers trail along the backs of pews, tracing the ridges of worn wood like reading a language I hadn't spoken since childhood. The altar was still there, centered, solemn, cracked at the base. And behind it, a wall that didn't look like it belonged. That's when I noticed it. The bricks behind the altar were newer. Not fresh, no, but newer. They didn't match the stone elsewhere. While the church was built in the late 1800s, this section, this sealed panel, looked no older than 50 or 60 years. The seams didn't line up right. The mortar had a different texture, and worse, it looked intentional. I pulled out the old floor plans I'd found in my father's safe. He'd kept everything: maps, deeds, records. And on the original blueprint, that back wall didn't exist. Instead, it showed a narrow hallway leading to a tiny storage room that should have been accessible. But there was no door, no hinge marks, no frame, only stone. As if the hallway had been devoured and replaced with silence. That night, I couldn't sleep. The wind outside whistled through the rafters like breath through clenched teeth. I lay awake on the cot I'd set up in the sacristy, staring at the ceiling, heart beating too fast for a man in a dead church. Something was wrong. I could feel it, not in the floorboards or the windows, but in my gut, like an itch beneath the skin of memory, like something had been erased, and my mind was begging to rewrite it. I got up, no lights, just the moon through stained glass. I grabbed a flashlight, a claw hammer from the supply closet, and walked barefoot back into the sanctuary. The air grew colder as I approached the altar. I touched the wall. It was cool, dry, but hummed faintly, not like sound, but like presence. I tapped lightly with the hammer, hollow. I tapped again, more firmly. Something shifted. A thin crack spidered across the mortar. Not natural. Someone had sealed something in here. I knew it. Not with cement, but with purpose. I pressed my ear to the stone. Nothing. but I couldn't leave it alone. I'd come too far, emotionally, spiritually, to turn back now. I swung the hammer harder. Dust burst into the air, the sound echoing against the empty pews like an accusation. One more strike, and a brick fell loose. Behind it, darkness. Not the kind you expect behind stone. This was emptier, blacker, and with it came something I hadn't prepared for. A smell. It was faint but distinct. The kind of scent that makes your stomach twist before your brain catches up. Old rot, dry decay. Not like mildew or damp wood, like something once alive had been buried without breath or blessing. My hand shook as I pulled out the second brick, then a third. The opening widened, and the air pushed back, warm, stale, and something else, something ancient and wrong. I stepped back, heart racing, flashlight beam trembling against the uneven stone. The crack was big enough now to fit a hand through, but I didn't reach in. Not yet. I stood there, listening. There was nothing on the other side. No rustle. No creak. But somehow, I felt watched. I wasn't alone in that room anymore. I just didn't know yet whether what was waiting had ever been human. There's a smell you never forget, even if you've never named it before. Not mildew, not damp cloth. Something sweeter, sicker, older. The scent of long-dried blood mixed with decades of silence. That's what hit me when the last brick fell. The flashlight beam caught a glimpse of the room beyond. Narrow, low, stone walls that didn't breathe. A dirt floor that had hardened with time, and in the far left corner, a shape, crumpled, still. I didn't move for a full minute. My legs rooted to the cracked stone of the sanctuary. My mind refused to catch up with what my eyes already knew. But something, maybe instinct, maybe duty, forced my foot forward. Then another. I squeezed through the narrow opening, scraping my shoulder against the jagged edge, feeling the heat of something too old to name. The air was thick, unmoving. I knelt, carefully, inches from the body. It was seated against the back wall, head bowed slightly, almost like prayer. Still dressed in what once might have been ceremonial robes, though the fabric had darkened with mold and time, crusted along the sleeves. The collar was turned up, stiff with decay. A rusted cross still hung from a chain around the neck, lodged in what was left of the chest cavity. But it wasn't the body that undid me. It was the hands. They were clenched tightly, fingers curled inward, stiff with rigor, but unmistakably wrapped around something. A leather-bound journal. Tears filled my eyes before I realized I was crying. I hadn't known this man, hadn't even known to miss him. But something about the way he'd been left, seated like a forgotten relic, stirred something that words don't reach. I touched the journal. The leather crackled beneath my fingertips, like it might shatter. But the clasp held. Carefully, almost reverently, I lifted it from the dead man's hands. The body shifted ever so slightly, as I did. And for a moment, I thought he might move. But no. Only the robe sagged. Only gravity reclaiming what life had long abandoned. I stood, backing toward the wall, flashlight in one hand, journal in the other. My breath came shallow. I looked again at the face. What was left of it? The cheekbones sunken in, the jaw slack, the eye sockets hollow. No name, no plaque, no sign. I exited the sealed room the same way I entered, brick dust clinging to my skin, hair damp with sweat. Back in the sanctuary, I set the journal down on the old altar and opened it. The first few pages were blank. Then, ink, sharp, precise, a hand used to confession. March 5th, 1965. I have not written in this journal since seminary, but I must write now, lest the truth die with me. My pulse quickened. He continued, I have discovered meetings taking place in the catacombs. Not prayer meetings, not worship. They speak of the church not as salvation, but as power. They twist the word. They mock scripture. I confronted them, and they laughed. Page after page, the entries grew darker. This was no ordinary journal. It was a witness, a documentation of betrayal inside a place meant for grace. Names weren't listed, but titles were. Deacon R, Trustee M, the choir director. Then, they threatened me. They told me to recant or resign. I chose neither. I chose the pulpit. I chose the truth. My hands trembled. The following Sunday, I was locked in this room. I believe they mean to keep me here. I have prayed, I have wept, but I no longer beg to be rescued. If these words are found, know that I died here in service to the truth, and that this church is not what it seems. The final line was smudged, ink smeared by what I could only imagine were the last tears he shed. I stood in silence, the journal still open before me. Beside the body, I remembered, had been two other things, a sealed wooden box and something small and black half buried in the dirt. I hadn't grabbed them. I hadn't dared. But now I had to go back. Because if that man had been telling the truth, and my gut told me he was, then whatever they'd done to him hadn't just been a murder. It had been a cover-up, a burial, a message. And somehow, for some reason, I was the only one who'd heard it. You could say I had a choice. Leave it be. Let the past rot behind the wall. Or open it wide and let whatever was buried crawl into the light. I picked up the flashlight again, and when I turned, I swore I saw something move at the far end of the pews. Just for a second. A flicker, a shape, watching. But when I shined the beam, there was nothing. Still, the back doors to the sanctuary were slightly open, and I hadn't left them that way. I didn't sleep that night. I tried. God knows I did. I lay on the cot in the sacristy with the journal pressed to my chest like a child clutching a blanket, my mind racing through every line, every broken sentence etched into that weathered leather book. But the images kept returning. His slumped body, the dry curl of his fingers around truth, the way the sanctuary seemed colder after I came back. Something had changed. It wasn't just the knowledge of what had happened. It was the weight of knowing that my father must have known. The next morning, I went back into the sealed room. My legs carried me there before the sun had fully broken over the tree line. I didn't even brush my teeth, just grabbed the flashlight and the crowbar I'd found in the tool shed. This time, I wasn't just looking. I was excavating. The body hadn't moved. That should have comforted me, but somehow it didn't. The smell had lessened, or maybe I'd just grown used to it. I bent down, squinting at the small object I'd seen before, half buried in the dirt. It wasn't just a scrap. It was a cassette tape, labeled in black marker, March 7th, 1965. Next to it, the sealed wooden box, heavy, bound in wax and thick rope, I brought them both out, laid them gently on the altar again. That altar had seen more truth in 48 hours than it probably had in half a century. I stared at the tape for a long time. There was an old cassette player buried in the back of the office filing cabinet, dusty, corroded at the edges. I loaded in fresh batteries, said a quick prayer, not for safety, but for clarity, and pressed play. The tape clicked, then static, and then his voice, Halberd's voice. My name is Charles Halberd. I am, at the time of this recording, the acting pastor of St. Bellamy Church. This may be the last time anyone hears my voice. He sounded calm, too calm. He went on, slowly, like each word was chosen with the care of a surgeon holding a scalpel. He described how he'd stumbled upon a series of late-night meetings in the lower hall, gatherings that weren't on the schedule, attended by men and women he'd trusted, some for years. He'd listened through air vents, hiding in darkness, notebook in hand. What they were planning wasn't just heretical. It was political, economic. There was talk of diverting church donations to private projects, altering sermons to steer community votes, and silencing dissent. Then came the part that made me grip the edge of the table. I have reason to believe my own son, Mark Halberd, is being groomed to take over once I'm gone. Not to preach, but to obey. If he inherits this church, it will not be God's doing. I dropped the recorder. The sound of it slapping the wood rang out like a gunshot in the still room. Mark Halberd, my father. He never told me. Not once. Not a word. He'd lived his whole life with that knowledge, buried it under sermons and smiles, Sunday clothes and family dinners. Never mentioned Charles. Never acknowledged the strange gap in our lineage. And now it made sense. Why my father never brought me to St. Bellamy as a child. Why he always changed the subject when I asked about his own father. Why, when he handed me the keys before he died, he said only, "Some inherit land, you inherit something else." I sat on the altar steps for hours, the recorder looping to static, the journal open on my knees. When I finally opened the wax-sealed box, my hands were numb. Inside were photographs, dozens of them, black and white, sepia-toned, some water-damaged beyond recognition, but others horrifyingly clear. Men in robes, seated in a circle, rituals that weren't scriptural, faces I recognized from church portraits lining the back hallway, trustees, elders. One of them, clear as daylight, was my great-uncle Samuel, smiling with a goblet in hand, the candlelight dancing over something scrawled on the stone floor beneath them. A single word, dominion. It wasn't just corruption. It was ideology, a different gospel altogether. And my family had been at the center of it. I tried to convince myself that my father had left it all behind, that he'd broken the chain. But why didn't he destroy the journal? Why didn't he burn the tape, bury the box? Unless he meant for me to find it. Unless he knew that the only way to cleanse the church was to let it judge itself. But I wasn't ready. Not yet. I placed the box, journal, and tape into my duffel bag, locked the sanctuary doors, pulled the heavy blinds. And that night, as I sat in the choir loft, watching shadows move across the pews, I realized something else. I wasn't alone. Somewhere in the rafters, or the walls, or the town itself, someone knew I had opened the wall. Someone knew I had the tape. And if this place had once been sealed to keep a secret in, there was no telling what might come out now that it was open. The next morning, I told myself I'd imagined it. The sound, the flicker of movement at the edge of my vision, the way the air in the sanctuary seemed to inhale when I exhaled. I told myself it was just fatigue, the mind's way of filling in gaps with ghosts. But that lie lasted all of 5 minutes, because when I stepped into the sanctuary at dawn, something was wrong. The altar, where I'd left the duffel bag containing the journal, the cassette, and the photographs, was empty, gone. No broken lock, no splintered wood, just absence. My hands shook as I circled the space. I checked the sacristy, the office, the utility closet. I even tore through the basement storage where old pews leaned against cobwebbed walls. Nothing. The only thing left behind was a single page. It lay at the foot of the pulpit, folded neatly, like an offering. I opened it. The paper was from the journal. One of the pages Halberd had written on, but the ink was smeared, as if handled by damp fingers, and across the original handwriting, someone had scrawled a message in thick red marker. Some walls were never meant to be broken. I dropped it. My knees hit the floor harder than I expected. Cold stone and colder truth. I wasn't alone. Someone had been inside the church. Someone who knew what I'd found. Someone who wanted me to stop, but they'd made a mistake. They'd left the tape recorder. It sat on the second pew, as if placed there on purpose. I picked it up, heart hammering against my ribs, and pressed play. It wasn't the tape from before. It was new. The static was sharper, then a voice, but not Halberd's, not my father's. It was mine, breathless, whispering. I'm not supposed to be here. I know that now. I thought I could handle it, thought the truth would set things right. But it's not just history I've opened. It's something else. Something that's been waiting. Then silence. Then, at the very end, a low, gravelly whisper. He sees you. I dropped the recorder, stumbling backward, my voice. But I had never recorded that. I had never said those words. I couldn't have. Unless someone had been recording me. Unless someone had followed me into the sealed room. Unless what I thought was solitude had been surveillance all along. I spent the next few hours locked in the office, drawing the blinds, clutching a letter opener like a weapon. Every creak of the wood, every gust of wind against the eaves made my muscles seize. This wasn't paranoia anymore. This was real. Someone was watching me, and they weren't trying to hide. By midday, I made the decision. I had to know what the town remembered. If no one inside the church would speak, maybe someone outside would. So I drove down to the Briar Falls Historical Society, tucked between the post office and the old diner with the broken neon sign. I asked about Charles Halberd. The woman behind the desk blinked. You mean the ghost story? I didn't even have to prompt her. She leaned in, voice low. They say he just vanished. Sunday morning. Mid-sermon. Folks said it was the rapture. Others said he ran off with a deacon's wife. No one's seen him since 65. I asked if there had ever been an investigation. She shrugged. Church closed for 2 weeks, reopened with a new pastor. People moved on. Moved on. Just like that. I returned to the church with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. This wasn't just a murder. It wasn't even just a cover-up. It was a rewrite. A whole life, an entire man, had been edited out of history, as if he never existed, as if by walling him in, they'd walled off the memory too. But history leaks. And that night, as I sat on the floor of the pulpit where Halberd likely delivered his final sermon, I knew I had one last card to play. There was a second cassette in the recorder, unlabeled. I hesitated, then pressed play. The voice that came through wasn't Halberd's. It was my father. "I'm sorry, son." My blood froze. "I never told you the truth. I wanted to. God knows I tried. But fear is a heavier thing than grief. And legacy is a chain we wear even when it's choking us." There was a pause, a shaky breath. "You were meant to find it. I left the journal where I knew you'd look. You always did have your mother's curiosity, but you have my burden now too." A sound in the background. Footsteps? Wind? "I couldn't fix it, but you might. Just be careful. The men who did this, they were never arrested, because they were never questioned. They're not gone, just older, quieter, still watching." The tape ended with the sound of something shutting. A door. And just before the click, a voice I'd never heard before, whispering, "He's listening now." I didn't sleep, not even for a minute. By now, the air in St. Bellamy didn't feel like air anymore. It felt like pressure, like a closed fist resting on the center of my chest, not heavy enough to kill, but just enough to warn. That night, I moved like a shadow through the old hallways. No lights, no sound. I stopped checking over my shoulder, because whatever was behind me, it already knew I was here. I brought the second recorder with me. I didn't know why. Maybe to prove I hadn't gone mad. Maybe to catch the whisper again. Or maybe, in some unspoken way, I wanted to leave behind my own confession, just in case. I descended the stairs into the undercroft. The stone corridor below the nave had always been a storage space. Dusty hymnals, broken candlesticks, forgotten Christmas decor. But now it felt different, colder. The air stung my lungs the deeper I went. The small archive room sat at the end of the corridor. No one had touched it in years. I broke the rusted latch with a crowbar and stepped inside. Papers, stacks of them, ledger books, old sermons, faded ink. I pulled out every folder that bore the Halberd name. There weren't many, just a thin file labeled H. Mayesk Clergy, and inside, folded 3 ways and sealed with a waxy residue, was a letter. It had been burned, half of it missing, edges black and curled like autumn leaves, but the rest remained. "To the future custodian of this church," it began, "if this letter finds you, then the walls have spoken again. You may be the first to listen, but be warned, not all who preach do so in the light." My hands trembled. I kept reading. "The church is not what it seems. It has a keeper, a man known only as the keyholder. He is not appointed by men of faith, but by men of silence. You will not find his name on any roster. He does not preach. He does not pray. He only watches. He ensures that what is buried remains buried. And if he knows you found what I hid, he will come." The bottom half of the letter was gone. devoured by flame. But it didn't matter, because just then I heard the sound, footsteps, not the creaking of wood above. These were slow, deliberate, booted, walking the stone floor behind me. I turned. No one. Only darkness in the corridor beyond the archive door. I stepped out, held the flashlight low, still nothing. But then I saw it. A handprint on the wall, fresh, pressed into the dust, long fingers, deep grooves. Not mine. I followed it, past the storage bins, toward the stairwell. And then, at the foot of the stairs, I saw the thing that made my blood freeze. The altar Bible. It was supposed to be in the sanctuary. It had always been chained to the lectern, but now it sat upright on the last step, its ribbon marker splayed open to a single passage. Luke 8:17. For nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest, nor is anything secret that will not be known and come to light. I felt sick. I climbed the stairs 2 at a time, shoved the heavy door open, and slammed it behind me. Back in the sanctuary, my breath fogged in front of me. The air shouldn't have been that cold, but something had changed. Something had shifted. And then I saw the figure, just for a flash, just long enough to make me question my sanity. Standing in the balcony, the choir loft, a man, tall, wide-shouldered, wearing what looked like a dark coat. He didn't move, didn't speak, but his presence was heavy. I blinked. He was gone. No sound, no door creaked, nothing. I ran up to the loft, but it was empty. Only dust, and a faint scent of pipe smoke hanging in the air. I stayed up that night watching the sanctuary from the pulpit, eyes burning, muscles tense. The church never slept, neither did I. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I packed the journal, the tape, the letter, photographed every page, made copies, drove into town and dropped sealed envelopes at the post office. One to a local reporter, one to the county records office, and one to myself, just in case. Because if the key holder was real, if someone had been chosen to protect this secret, then I had just lit a match in his dry, quiet world. And I wasn't sure what would burn first, St. Bellamy's reputation or me. I stood behind the pulpit on Sunday morning, the same place my grandfather stood nearly 60 years ago. The church was fuller than I'd seen it since I arrived. Word had spread about the reopening, about my father's death, about something vague and old stirring inside these walls. They came curious. They came cautious. Some came to pray. Others came to watch. And I came to speak. Not about salvation, not about judgment, but about truth. The stained glass windows scattered fractured light across the pews. The morning sun flickered red, gold, and blue across the worn faces of people I barely knew, but who somehow already seemed woven into the bloodline of this story. I opened the leather journal slowly. The room fell silent. My name is Jacob Halberd, I said, and this is the last sermon this pulpit will ever hold for the man who built it. Not just for the preacher, but for the man. Eyes shifted. A few lowered their heads. One woman, gray-haired, thin-lipped, clutched a rosary tighter. I read pieces from the journal. The entries about the secret meetings, about the warnings, the threats, the silence that followed. I played a clip from the cassette. just a short fragment. My grandfather's voice trembling as he confessed what he knew and what he feared. And then I looked up. He died here, not on paper, not in rumor, not in disgrace or disappearance. He died right here, behind this wall, sealed into silence, forgotten on purpose. Gasps, shuffling. Someone whispered, "Dear God." But he wasn't the only one who stayed silent, I continued. Others knew. Some are still alive. Some may be sitting here. That woman with the rosary? She stood. I was 17, she said, voice shaking. I was the cook's daughter. I brought meals to the meeting room. I never understood what they were doing, but the night he vanished, I heard yelling. And the next morning, they told me never to speak of it again, so I didn't. Silence stretched across the room like a second skin. Then another voice, an old man in the front row. I voted to replace him. They told us he'd left. I believed them. No outrage, no riot, just a slow unraveling of collective guilt. I stepped away from the pulpit, leaving the journal open for anyone who wanted to read it. This building is not holy because of what it hides, I said. It's holy because of what we choose to face. And maybe because of what we set free. I didn't finish the service. There was nothing left to preach. I walked out the front doors into the sunlight, the air warm for the first time in weeks. Later that afternoon, the Historical Society called. They'd received my documents. So had the county. An inquiry had been opened into St. Bellamy's leadership history. The story was out. That night, I stood alone in the sanctuary one last time. The air felt lighter. The silence no longer suffocating, but still. Peaceful, almost. I climbed up to the choir loft, lit a candle, and placed it on the ledge. Then I whispered aloud, not sure if to God or to my grandfather, "It's done." I don't know what I inherited, really. Not just a church, not just a secret, but a voice. One that was buried once, but now speaks again. And I think, no, I believe it's better this way.